So tonight, our presentation is Flying Colors, A Brief History of Bird Art with Terri Susan Zurbrigg. Susan's a member of the Edmonton Nature Club, and she's given us some excellent presentations in the past. And when she sent me this, and she sent me some pictures, which went out in the communication email to everybody to get the link. And I seen her artwork in the past, and I thought, given the topic, I can't go away with not showing one of her drawings or more of the birds that she has done. You are a fantastic artist, Terri Susan, and this picture of the gull just does you so much credit. It's an amazing, amazing drawing. It actually looks to me almost like a photograph. So that's the degree of work that you are able to do and with your expertise. So well done. And just as another aside, this is an owl she did for the club before in the past as well. Again, excellent artistic abilities. So with that, Terri Susan, I'll let you get started and stop share my screen so you can share your presentation and start. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that lovely introduction, and thanks everyone for being here tonight. So I'm going to share my screen now so I can get my presentation started. Here we go. I'm just going to zip up to the top. There we go. Now, right away, you can probably see I changed the title of my talk just slightly, but don't worry, the topic is the same. I'm still going to guide you through a history of bird art, or rather my particular version of it. But before we do that, I'm going to tell you a story about the West Mexican chachalaca, because that bird is a catalyst to my training as a bird artist. And you might be thinking, okay, chachalacas are not really known as game changers as birds, but hear me out. I'm going to take you back to the winter of 2014, and you might be quite happy to join me there, as in many ways it was a simpler time. To escape the Edmonton weather, I found myself in Hualtuco, Mexico, perched on a rock at sunrise, looking through my binoculars at a bird that slightly resembled a chicken. I later learned it was a West Mexican chachalaca, a common bird in this type of in this part of Mexico, and they tend to gather in large groups at dawn and dusk. Also, they can be very, very loud. So the next morning, I was up again at dawn, binoculars at the ready, and I was in bird mode. So it didn't really occur to me that a woman skulking by herself along the edge of the forest might raise some eyebrows. And I was soon approached by a rather muscular looking resort security guard who politely asked me if I needed help finding the yoga class. I told him that I wasn't lost. I was just waiting for the chachalacas to wake up. And he gave me a strange look and said, "You're looking for chachalacas? Why?" And I didn't get a chance to answer him because just then the chachalacas woke up, and they are indeed very, very loud. So loud that further conversation was not possible. So at that moment, a chachalaca popped out of the foliage. So I offered him my binoculars, and he took a look. And then he kept on looking. And when he gave me my binoculars back a few minutes later, when it was quieter, he was crying. And as he wiped his eyes, he said, "I never knew they were so beautiful. All this time, they've been here all around me, and I never realized." And this encounter happened about 6 months after I'd started drawing birds again after a rather long hiatus. All throughout my childhood, I drew birds nonstop. I adorned every page of my school notebooks with sketches of my budgie, T-Bird. But the focus of tonight's talk is what happened after I got started again. And that part of my story begins with this early morning encounter where a burly security guard was moved to tears by the beauty of chachalacas. Because it was in that moment that I realized I wanted to make paintings that would do what that look through my binoculars had done, make people look more closely at birds and realize how beautiful they are. But for a painting to do that, the artist has to be really, really good. And so I had my mission. I chose to accept it. I had to get really, really good at painting birds. So how to begin? I thought drawing birds would be a good place to start. And so for the next 7 years or so, that's what I did. I drew birds constantly. Here's what my studio floor looked like every few months. To be clear, I don't keep my drawings on the floor, but when my walls get too full, I gather everything together and store it. And my first instinct wasn't wrong, but it was only part of the battle. I was getting to know my subject, birds, but I needed to improve my craft, drawing and painting. And so I'd heard about this bird painter named John James Audubon. And I got the impression he was a pretty big deal, so I ordered a book of his paintings, and I'm going to say something rather shocking now, so brace yourselves. I kind of thought his owls looked a bit weird. So I kept looking, I kept researching other artists, and we're going to talk tonight about Edward Lear and Fenwick Lansdowne, who's Canadian, and William Cooper. And I promise we're going to talk about Audubon too, and I have nice things to say about him. But it was clear to me as I was researching these bird artists, all these amazing natural history artists, they painted birds beautifully in watercolor in exquisite detail. But those paintings didn't look like the painting ideas that flashed into my brain when I was out in the field watching birds. What I had in mind, what I wanted to paint were oil paintings. And so I started researching oil paintings. And here's one of my favorites. And just for the record, there are a lot of oil paintings I love that don't have birds in them, but this one does. There's a cockatoo there tormenting that small dog. And this painting is by Charles Bargue. He's a 19th century painter from France. It's called The Chess Game. And looking at this painting, it gives you a bit of an idea what it feels like to study the great oil painters of the Western tradition through the eyes of a birder. Because in a way, it's a lot like birding. I was exploring this vast, largely unfamiliar territory on the lookout for birds, and sometimes you see them and sometimes you don't. Um, my research into oil painting introduced me to something called academic training. Now, the word training isn't a word that you hear many artists say. We hear athletes talk about training, or ballerinas or gymnasts, classical musicians maybe, but artists? Aren't artists just born knowing how to draw? In fact, for most of history, artists trained hard, really hard. Leading up to the Renaissance and until the early middle of the 20th century, if you wanted to be an artist, it was expected that you'd undergo a lengthy, rigorous training program, either as an apprentice or by studying at an academy. Um, by 19th century, France had developed l'École des Beaux-Arts. There were other academies throughout Europe that all of them had these intensive programs. And to my delight, a few years ago, I learned that this academic training was actually being offered online. So I enrolled in a program, and here's some of the drawings that I did. These are called Bargue drawings. These are copies of lithographic plates developed by Charles Bargue, the same artist who painted that cockatoo we were just looking at. Along with an artist named Jerome, he played a pivotal role in shaping academic training of the 19th century. Bargue drawings are like basic training for academically trained artists. And it was around this time I had what I call my Goldilocks and Ghostbusters moment. Goldilocks because none of the art I was looking at was just right in terms of the work I wanted to make. I wanted to paint the way they did in the Dutch Golden Age or in the 19th century, but I wanted to paint birds. And from what I could tell, bird art, to the extent that it had its own genre, consisted primarily of scientific illustration and watercolor. So my just right would be the subject matter, that large variety of birds depicted in scientific bird illustration, but then with the painting craft of the master oil painters. So that discovery sort of led to my Ghostbusters moment, which I'm still very much in the thick of. Can I cross the streams? I know in Ghostbusters, you're really not supposed to do that until the very end when it becomes necessary for self-preservation. But I feel that's kind of what I'm doing as an artist. And at this stage of my training, I've been very lucky to train under excellent artists who have made me so much better at drawing. But most of the time while I've been training, I feel like a bit of a hockey player who's desperate for ice time surrounded by elite basketball players. Training in this way has enabled me to reach a certain level of athleticism, but I also need to figure out how to skate. And by skate, I mean draw and paint feathers. And the academic tradition is based on training figurative artists, so people who want to paint people. So luckily, I've found a classically trained artist who doesn't think I'm completely nuts and who's mentoring me as I birdify an academic art curriculum. And this is some of the work I've done since changing how I train. I've got several more years of intense training ahead of me, but as the AC/DC song goes, it's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll, and I feel so much better about my training now. So what does all of this intro have to do with the topic of tonight's talk? Well, a core component of any academic training program for an artist is completing what are called master copies. So much like musicians will play cover songs to learn their instruments, academically trained artists will copy drawings and paintings of master artists. So this is a copy of a master copy of a drawing I did last year of a Ray Harris Ching drawing of a kookaburra. And we're going to talk a lot more about Ray Harris Ching. He's my favorite artist. So in a way, what I'm doing in this talk this evening is sharing my homework. It's the research I did in figuring out whose work I want to train from. And little did I know that this seemingly straightforward question was going to actually lead to some more complex questions about where birds sit overall within the Western art tradition. So before we dive in, I've got two disclaimers. First, I am not an art historian. I'm just a girl who loves drawing birds. Second, I have a rather specific goal in mind in that I'm training as an oil painter, specifically one who's head over heels for traditional academic painting methods. So both of these disclaimers are reflected in the revised title of my talk. This is a look through my binoculars, my art binoculars, a path I went down after that life-altering encounter with the chachalaca. So let's begin with Albrecht Dürer, who's not a bird artist, but he did draw the occasional bird. So Dürer made these studies of a blue roller around 1500. These are done in watercolor and gouache. As you can see, they're beautifully painted, not just in terms of the exquisite texture, but also in terms of the anatomical accuracy. So there's a tremendous amount to learn here about wing anatomy, but also in terms of feather texture. And Dürer is known for his meticulous attention to accuracy, and he was a big believer in direct observation from the natural world. Now, one of the things I noticed when I was studying art from the 1500s and 1600s is that a lot of the birds are dead. They are table fare. They're prey that's been hunted. And so these paintings, while they are of birds, they have a lot to say about the wealth and status and what was going on in society at that time. And perhaps as a reminder of the brevity of life, which was a huge theme in Dutch oil painting around this time. So this is sort of into the Dutch Golden Age. But as someone whose mission in life is to paint feathers really, really well, you can see how studying these paintings or snippets of them would be really valuable from a training standpoint. Now, as I mentioned, hunting was popular at this time. Excuse me, but it was not something for the common folk. That brings me to this Rembrandt painting, because you know that if Rembrandt painted a bird, I'm going to tell you about it. This is a self-portrait of Rembrandt, and he's holding a dead bittern. The only thing I've concluded from my research on this painting is that no one agrees what it means. I've read theories suggesting that Rembrandt's actually being quite naughty, and that that has something to do with a pun on the word bittern that I don't understand because I don't speak Dutch. Others opine that he's trying to climb the social ladder by presenting himself as a hunter, because hunting was limited to the wealthy and the upper classes. Rembrandt would not have been part of that class, and so he's suggested it's been trying to rise up. Others have suggested that by thrusting the bittern forward in the composition and placing that much light on it, he's saying, look how well I can paint. And so it's sort of an assertion of his skill as an artist. Speaking of Rembrandt, I was in Amsterdam recently, and the Rembrandt Museum's located there. And while I was there, I spent quite a bit of time at the Rijksmuseum. So while there, I conducted a bit of a mischievous experiment, because just out of curiosity, I wanted to see how many birds, or if there were any birds, in the Gallery of Honor. That's the second floor, or part of the second floor of the Rijksmuseum, where some of the most important paintings from the Dutch Golden Age are hung. So that's where they keep the Vermeers and the Rembrandts. And so after I spent a great deal of time swooning over those, I went birding in the Rijksmuseum. And I did not post that list on eBird, in case you're wondering. But I was thrilled when I saw this painting. This is called The Threatened Swan by Jan Aslen. I am probably not pronouncing that correctly. So here's the question. Is this painting about a swan? The answer to that is a qualified yes. It's very skillfully painted. The translucence where the light is coming through the primary feathers, the attention that's paid to the feet. And just as a side note, that's kind of how you establish your street cred as a bird artist, is you've got to paint the feet really well. That's what we tend to look at. But overall, you look at this painting and you can take it at face value. This is a swan fiercely and mightily defending her nest from a marauding dog. And if you didn't see the dog, he's peeking out of the water in the lower left-hand corner there. But that is not why this painting's hanging in the Gallery of Honor, most likely, as much as it chagrins me to admit that. The late 1600s was a tumultuous time in Dutch history, and in 1672, the head of state was brutally murdered. And you can see, if you look closely, the word Holland is written on one of the swan's eggs. And then between the swan's feet and just on the line where the water meets the land, there's some slogans, and those are politically significant in their meaning. But they were also added at least 22 years after the artist died. So they were added later. And by that textual alteration to the painting, it changed it as basically, it became sort of a national symbol, an allegory. And so it was really that transformation that I think led to its status. And it was the first painting that was purchased by the museum in 1800. And so there it is in the Gallery of Honor. So I very much enjoyed looking at it. And then just three left turns later, in another part of the second floor, were 7 paintings by my favorite artist from this period, Melchior de Hondecoeter. So he comes from a long line of poultry painters. You heard that correctly. At this point in history, there were people whose job it was to paint chickens and to paint ducks and geese. So of all the artists I've talked about so far, he's the first I'd put in the category of actual bird painter rather than artist who paints occasional bird. De Hondecoeter was the bird artist for William of Orange, the king. And at this time in history, the wealthy and powerful are filling their country properties with exotic animals. And to ensure they had an inventory of their wealth and status, they would hire artists to paint their menageries. And this painting is actually called The Menagerie, and the king hung it outside of his bedroom on his country property. So if you look closely, it's really a map of Dutch colonial exploits. These birds are from several different continents. I've given you a species list. It is an interesting thing to identify birds in bird paintings, and sometimes the ID quibbles and questions can be as fraught as they are in the field. But these birds would not coexist in the wild. They could only be assembled in this manner if people put them there. And if you look closely, you can see these birds, they're outside, they're alive, but they're not free. So the cockatoo's got a chain on his leg, so does the lorikeet on the bottom. And if you look closely at the rose-ringed parakeet, his wings are clipped, his primary feathers are missing. So these guys are captive and far from home. This is probably my favorite painting of de Hondecoeter's. It's called Pelican and Other Birds. It's mostly known, though, as Floating Feather, and that's a nod to that exquisitely painted feather in the bottom right of the painting. And when you see it in real life, like it is, the way that it's resting on that water and the water tension is just extraordinary. I spent a full day at the Rijksmuseum studying this painting, which was a great learning opportunity, but it was also a really good way to eavesdrop inconspicuously as people were walking by. So on a museum floor full of figurative and still life painting, I wanted to see how people would respond to a very large oil painting of birds. And I heard a lot of gasps and a lot of, wow, pelicans are really beautiful, aren't they? I've never looked at one that closely. And does that sound familiar? Because it reminded me of what my security guard friend from Mexico said about a chachalaca. And so here's de Hondecoeter doing with his work exactly what I'd like to do with mine, making people who were otherwise just sort of milling about or walking by stop dead in their tracks and stare at a bird and realize, often for the first time, how incredible they are. But he was able to elicit that reaction because he's one of the best feather painters of all time. Just look at the wing on that pelican. What I love most about this painting is that human presence or influence is much less apparent. These birds aren't being depicted as captive guests on the king's grounds. These birds are their own society. They are their own world. Those ducks are interacting, and whatever conversation they're having has nothing to do with us. And the larger birds in the painting, which at the time were referred to as ornamental birds, which tells you a lot about how they were viewed in society. But I don't think de Hondecoeter sees them that way. They are looking directly at us, the viewer, and there's a slight wariness to their gaze. At least that's how it feels to me. And as birders, we've all experienced a moment like this when you see a heron, and the moment the heron registers your presence, its body language changes, and suddenly there's that tension. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how eye contact works in bird paintings and how different considerations apply than those that might be engaged with human portraiture, where the dynamics around eye contact is quite different. So that's going to conclude our whirlwind tour through the Dutch Golden Age, and we're going to move ahead now, skip a century and move ahead to the 1800s, where the science of ornithology is emerging. So bird skins and specimens of new birds are being collected and making an appearance in England and Europe for the first time and being named for Western science. Indigenous societies had named the birds long before that. And the tradition of ornithological illustration, that's a mouthful, was born. So I'm showing you a slide here now of John and Elizabeth Gould. They are the ultimate power couple of scientific bird illustration. This is around the 1930s, and John Gould was the head curator and taxidermist at the Royal Zoological Society of London. And Elizabeth Gould was born in 1804 to a well-to-do family at a time when there wasn't much for unmarried women to do other than become a governess. She did that, and by all accounts, she was bored out of her mind. Fortunately, her brother had an interest in taxidermy, and through his work at the Zoological Society, he introduced her to John Gould, and they got married, and the rest is history. Relatively early on in their marriage, John Gould came home from work and said the thing that husbands so often say to their wives. Darling, an absolutely superb collection of bird specimens just arrived from the Himalayas, and I really want to do a series of lithographic plates. And Elizabeth said, marvelous idea. Who will you get to do the drawings? And he said, well, you. Here's one of the plates she drew for a folio on Himalayan birds. This is the first in what would become known as the Gould folios. Formal artistic training wasn't really on the menu for women at that time, but given her background, Elizabeth would have received basic tutoring in drawing and watercolor, and she was quite good at painting. And John, who drew birds extensively to study them scientifically, had noticed this and thought, hey, maybe we can be a team here. So in addition to being the artist for the plates and the Gould folios, Elizabeth Gould was also quite busy having children. She had 8, 6 of whom survived, and so she needed reinforcements. And this was one of the factors that led John Gould to hire an artist named Edward Lear to assist with the drawings and the lithography. So I'm going to take a moment now and briefly explain lithography, or try to. So with lithographic prints, each print is unique. The bird is drawn on a porous piece of limestone with a wax pencil. A layer of oily ink is applied, and it's run through a printing press. And that gives you the black and white plate, or the black and white drawing. And then it's hand colored with watercolor over top, either by the artist or by someone who's been hired to do that stage. And during this time in history, there's this sort of unknown army of Victorian women who were actually trained in this watercolor tinting. So it's quite an involved process. And Elizabeth learned about this process through Edward Lear, who had more or less taught himself. So Edward Lear was the 20th of 21 children, born into a family where his father was a wealthy stockbroker, but unfortunately his fortunes reversed, the family lost its money, and Edward fell on hard times and was raised by his eldest sister. But he grew up, he was fascinated by natural history. And at age 18, he got permission from the Royal Zoological Society to paint the parrots in the London Zoo. And it took him 2 years, and the result was this book. The paintings are stunning. They were released as lithographic prints. But unfortunately, the book was not successful financially. And so bird artists of this time, bird illustrators, they're really in on the ground floor of crowdfunding. They didn't have GoFundMe pages, but what they would do is they would elicit subscriptions from wealthy people. It was really only the upper classes and institutions that could afford to buy these books. And they'd get those subscriber fees, and then they'd paint the birds in installments. And so you'd get a plate at a time or a couple of plates at a time. And over the course of years, you'd get the entire collection, and then it would be bound. And so Edward has released this book. It's established his reputation, but not his bank account. And John Gould has these very ambitious plans to paint all these folios, and is thinking, okay, I could use this guy. I don't want him as my competition. I want him on my payroll. And so by all accounts, Edward Lear and Elizabeth Gould worked really well together, maybe less so with John. John Gould hired a number of artists over the years to assist with painting the plates in the Gould folios, and had strained relationships with several of them. But here's a side-by-side plates that were painted by Elizabeth Gould and by Edward Lear. Hers is on the left and his is on the right. I've put these up here just to give you a sense of what some of the conventions of this illustration tradition are generally. The bird must be painted accurately, scientifically. Scientific accuracy is the priority. So the number of feathers has to be right. The proportions have to be spot on, because this is about assisting people with identifying birds for scientific purposes. But I mean, it's also a celebration of their beauty. The birds are often, but not always, portrayed in profile, but they're in a pose that's usually somewhat restrained, so that you can see the entire bird, or the prevalent field marks. The point of these is that the bird is the focus. The background is present, it's hinted at, so you get a hint of habitat, but it's very much secondary. So in her very short life, Elizabeth died at age 37 after giving birth to her 8th child. She painted 600 of these lithographic plates. So in total, the Gould folios consist of 2,999 plates, and scholars have stated that she painted 600 of those. These weren't strictly speaking Gould folios, but she also did some of the paintings for Charles Darwin for the zoology of the HMS Beagle, so his trip, including his visit to the Galapagos Islands. And so here's some Galapagos finches that she painted, along with compliments from Charles Darwin. Now, I'm not going to get into this in detail, but there is kind of an interesting and evolving debate in the scholarship about how involved John Gould was in the drawings. And throughout history, his prominence as the draftsperson is somewhat diminishing as research on this evolves, but it's an interesting story nonetheless. So from a how do these paintings get made standpoint, and I think I'm going to turn back to the toucans and the toucanettes, because I think it helps explain this a bit, but these paintings are being made from specimens that have been collected. And while that provides very valuable reference, you can hold the bird up, you can look at it, you can count the feathers, it's extremely difficult to draw a bird that you haven't observed in nature. And so if you haven't seen it in real life, you don't know how it stands, you don't know how it moves, how it behaves. And so these paintings are excellent, but in some of them that you see painted in this time, the bird's actually not accurate, because these artists are trying their best to basically reconstruct something that they've never actually seen. Another challenge of being a bird artist working in this tradition is that your compositional freedom is constrained so much, because you have to position a bird in the way that communicates that information. But so is one of an artist's major tools, the use of dramatic light and shadow, because it's so important that the bird's feathers are communicated completely, that you have to have the whole bird basically in light. And so as a result of that, when one of your tools as an artist is being taken away, that constraint forces you to get creative with others. And so these drawings really amp up the composition and the focus on interesting shape to help engage the viewer's eye. And there's no better segue to a discussion on Audubon than that comment on lively and dynamic compositions, because that's what he's so well known for. So there is a lot to say about Audubon, and I'm not going, my time this evening is limited, but if you'd like to learn more about him, I recommend you get a copy of Ken Kaufman's latest book. It's called The Birds That Audubon Missed. And yes, that Ken Kaufman, the one whose field guide for advanced birding many of us have in our glove compartments. He's done an excellent job of really doing some just superb research, and he's crafted a wonderful book. Not only does it lays out the power struggles within the ornithological art scene of 19th century America, a hitherto untapped source of human drama, but on a much more serious note, he takes a really unflinching look at Audubon, including the fact that he owned slaves. And so my talk tonight focuses less on Audubon's biographical information and more on his studies as a bird artist, but I did want to mention that book in case you're interested in reading more. When Audubon first moved to his father's estate in Pennsylvania as a young man, he fell in love with Lucy, the girl next door, and he soon realized that supporting a wife and family as a bird artist was going to be a challenge, so he tried his hand at business. It did not go well. Some of that was his fault, some of that was just plain bad luck. But when I came across this quote from an essay of his that he wrote, it's an autobiographical account that I believe he wrote for his sons. It just tells you everything you need to know about how his business acumen was lacking. So he says, the mercantile business did not suit me. When traveling and driving, several horses before me laden with goods and dollars, I lost sight of the pack saddles and the cash they bore to watch the motions of a warbler. So here he is, horse full of merch, and he sees a warbler, dismounts his horse, and goes off chasing the bird. And apparently, according to this quote, that wasn't an uncommon occurrence. So that probably gives you a sense of why he might have had some financial struggles. Some sources have him in debtor's prison, others merely have him declaring bankruptcy, but all sources agree he basically hit financial rock bottom. And he decides it would be an opportune time to say to his wife, and at this time they had children, you know how I'm going to get us out of this? By publishing the bird book to end all bird books. I'm going to draw the birds of America life size. And I'm being a little bit glib, but Audubon had to go to the United Kingdom to make this happen. He had a gift for offending people, at least in Philadelphia, which was the hotbed of that held the keys to ornithological illustration at the time. So, having alienated those people, or most of them, he headed off to England. And interestingly, what kept him locked out of Philly ended up being his passport to the inner circles of the UK. He really played up this American woodsman persona, and hair smeared with bear grease quickly became the darling of the dinner party circle in London. And that's what clinched the deal. He found a publisher and an engraver, and the Birds of America took off. From 1827 to 1838, 11 years, 435 plates, 489 species, and 1,065 individual birds. So the Birds of America was a book that only the very wealthy could afford. Fewer than 200 were actually produced. It was so massive that in order to read it, you really needed almost a special piece of furniture. And when I came across this photo, I thought, oh, this would be great to include just to give you a visual of this. This is sort of like a desk type piece of furniture that people at this time would have to read and to look at these massive folios. Now, I think Audubon's was among the biggest, but he was painting on double elephant folio-sized watercolor paper. So for frame of reference, I have just a lovely photograph. Sorry, I took that the week the snow mold was really bad. Photograph of me in my studio. I'm holding a piece of standard watercolor paper. It's 22 by 30 inches. I'm 5'7". And so the paper that Audubon's painting on is about a third larger than that I'm holding. So these drawings were massive. And many plates had multiple birds on them. So what he did with the Birds of America is no small feat. But even then, he's painting the birds life size. And so you kind of had to contort some, especially the larger ones, to get them to fit. And so I've included this plate of the flamingo to show you that, that constraint or that issue he faced, but also to demonstrate that there's a difference between his original watercolor paintings and then what ended up in the actual Birds of America. So as I explained that lithographic process, Audubon worked with an engraver, and whose name was Robert Havell. He was considered the best engraver at London of the time. But Audubon was pressed for time. He had his work cut out for him, and he also really didn't like painting backgrounds. And so his engraver would actually do some of that work for him. And so he'd send off the watercolor of the bird, and then some background, some other elements would be added in. So that wasn't uncommon. And it's actually a very interesting exercise. At least for me, Saturday night rolls around. What else are you going to do? You can study the differences between the watercolor and the plates. Now, Audubon, in addition to being an artist, he's actually not a bad writer. To accompany Birds of America, he wrote this long text of journal entries and observations he made while out in the field. And his original intention was to include that actually with the Birds of America, but in order to do that, he would have had to give 5 copies of it to the Copyright Office. And because it was so extraordinarily expensive to produce, he couldn't do that. And so he ended up publishing that separately as a 5-volume, I believe it's 5 volumes, book called The Ornithological Biography. Um, so I'd like to turn now to how Audubon worked, because that's actually quite interesting. He wanted to draw nature, and so that second quote, or no, the one in the middle, he wanted to copy nature in her own way, alive and moving. And you can see in the quote above that, there's sort of some shots fired at those early paintings we looked at with the dead poultry, with the birds hanging from their legs. And he drew some of those as he was studying. He drew the drawing of a specimen hung to a string by 1 foot. And in doing that, he made some pretty fair signboards for poulterers. So he's basically saying, I'm not painting posters for people that are selling chickens. I want to paint birds alive and moving. And therein lies the ultimate challenge facing bird artists. What we draw moves a lot, and it can fly away at any moment. And Audubon, like many of us, finds this at times quite challenging and frustrating. So he thought, okay, I'm going to see if I can just draw them. I'll watch them in the field. Let's see how this goes. And he grew quite fond of a small family of peewees that he encountered near his home. And he'd watch them day in and day out. And he says he formed hundreds of outlines of his peewees. So he's doing these quick sketches, but he could finish none of them. He couldn't get any of those drawings to a level where he was satisfied with the level of finish or detail. And that's how he wanted to paint them in all of their glorious detail. So here's how he got around it. It's a little bit ghastly, but it got the job done. And remember, I mean, you kind of wince sometimes when you hear this. These people, they didn't have cameras. So it was either you drew the bird out in the field and made the best of your sketches. You had the assistance of a specimen. Those weren't always they were arguably easier to come by then because there were no laws protecting the birds against hunting as there are now. Or you do what Audubon did, which was come up with your own system, where he did go and shoot the birds to collect the specimens, and then after it was freshly dead, he basically contort it. He'd rig up this board with wires and nails, and he'd basically impale the bird and sort of suspend it from this board while it was still malleable. So, it's not for the weak of stomach. And then he'd basically paint it as quickly as he could before it began to rot. And on the larger birds, that could get a little dicey. There's some interesting diary entries he had about a turkey. But as a result of this methods, Audubon's composition are incredibly lively and dramatic and really reflect how he saw the birds when he looked at them. And you really get a sense of a glimpse into the bird's world. That's what's so phenomenal about these paintings, I think. And I've given you sort of a sampling here of sort of a like slow, medium, and really intense in terms of like the compositional drama. And I don't want to make this talk political, so please do not read anything into the fact that I've selected magpies as one of the birds here, even though they are a strong candidate in Edmonton's upcoming city bird election. No, I'm just being facetious, but you can see in these, like, there's a story to them. There's narrative. Audubon is not like these are can be for science, but they're also just for appreciation of the birds, and just such drama and dynamism in those compositions. And I love the house wrens in the hat. That's probably my favorite Audubon plate. So that gives you, that's all I'm going to say about Audubon. I know it's a bit of a whirlwind, and you've gotten now hopefully a sense of 19th century bird illustration. But before we leave that topic entirely, I wanted to share this quote with Joseph Wolf. I haven't talked about his work in detail, but he's working in this tradition as well. He's actually considered to be one of the best animal painters of the 19th century. Also, another one on the list of people who didn't get along with John Gould. But this quote makes me both sad and curious. He says this in 1899, which is the last year of his life, I believe, and he says, "If you paint a dead redpoll or a linnet, it's admissible at the Royal Academy. If you paint it alive, it's a transcript of an object of natural history." And the frustration, and I think possibly even sadness, that he's expressing in this is he's basically saying there's a hierarchy here. If I'm going to paint one of those, what Audubon would call one of those poultry signs. It's art, and I can get into the Royal Academy, which was in London. Like, that was the art show you wanted to get into and have your work shown at. But if you paint it alive, it's just a science illustration. And he's basically, I think, in a way, sort of saying, this isn't fair. We're artists too. And I'm going to touch on that tension a little bit, but those who know me well, I'm a born contrarian, and so I had to test this theory and see, did anyone paint a live bird that got into the Royal Academy? The answer is yes. And so I happened upon this artist and just got so excited. This is Henry Stacy Marks. He's like de Hondecoeter's long lost 19th century brother, not genetically, but spiritually. And when I came across his work, it kind of seems to me like there's every century produces its one rebel painter who, despite the fact that birds aren't a focal point generally in Western art and in representational painting, decides to go ahead and just paint them anyway. And so I love this painting. This is exceptional. And it's picking up on sort of that de Hondecoeter theme in the Floating Feather, where the birds are their own society. You've got them here. The painting title is A Select Committee. And so these birds are having a meeting. Like, maybe this is their morning meeting. But there is human presence in this painting because the architectural structure they're in, there's plants, but the plants are inside. The wooden perches the birds are perched on aren't trees, they're man-made. So there's an interesting tension in this work. But he did have a painting in the Royal Academy. So not only that, but it's still there. So when artists were voted into the Royal Academy, which is no small thing, you have to be elected. As a thank you for that extraordinary honor, you have to give them it's called your diploma piece, and then it's a piece that's donated to the Royal Academy, and that forms some of their collections. So donated pieces from when artists have been elected are there, and you can go look at them. So this is his Science is Measurement. And so it doesn't really prove the point very well because this is a dead bird, it's a skeleton. But at the same time, it is a bird painting that is like this is that sort of more traditional form of art, the art that's getting all the attention, that's getting into the museums. And you've got some commentary going on about what's going on in science here. And so that's not just happening in those scientific monographs. And so the artist tells the story about this painting, about how he was studying the bird and taking the precise measurements. And he just thought, this skeleton is gorgeous enough to paint. This process is worthy of a painting. I'm going to do that. And that's going to be my diploma piece. So here it is. But Joseph Wolfe, in that quotation that I shared, I still think he makes a really fair point about that hierarchy between illustration and art, which brings me to, well, which is which and how do you define them? And is there even value in doing that? So I'm going to talk about this a bit as we move into some 20th century bird illustrators. This is William T. Cooper. He's an Australian bird illustrator. And I'd like to show you some of his works. You have something beautiful to look at while I share some thoughts about definitions of illustration and art. So the best definition of illustration that I've come across is from an art historian named Micah Christensen. And he defines it as an image that depends on text or supports a text. So there's this symbiotic relationship between the painting and a piece of text that it's either being used to explain or supplement. And so, well, Christensen, in proffering that definition, wasn't speaking about natural history art. I've nevertheless found that definition to be very helpful to my thinking. Because a lot of 19th century bird illustration would fall under that umbrella, because those paintings are plates in scientific monographs, and they're going to be accompanied by text that gives you ornithological information. It's worth pausing here to note that, in fact, probably, I haven't counted, but most of the world's bird paintings live in natural history books. They live in books on pages rather than walls. And so I wonder if that distinction as well is one of the reasons why people are more inclined to think of these as bird illustrations, the fact that they're not on canvas and hung on walls, but live on pages. So if that's illustration, well, what's art? Depends on who you ask. And it's a question that eludes consensus. You might get opinions, some more defensible than others. I prefer descriptions, and this is the best one that I've come across. This is Kenneth Clark, an art historian writing in the middle of the 20th century, who said, "Facts become art through love." And I chose that quotation because, well, it gives me the chills, but also because when you look at these paintings, you feel that love. You feel that quiet but palpable reverence for the beauty and wonder of these birds. This is not just about information. Facts become art through love. And I think a lot of it for me comes down to the tone of voice and the attitude behind the utterance of that word. And so David Attenborough says of William Cooper that he is the finest bird illustrator of the 20th century. And the fact that Attenborough is referring to him as an illustrator and not an artist, I don't at that point think it matters, because how much he respects the work is so apparent. So I think a lot of it has to do with the tone of voice and the intentions of the person saying it. So enough about that. Here's a fun story about how Cooper met Audubon. So in 1979, David Attenborough was in Australia, and he had just signed a book deal with his Australian publishers for Life on Earth. And as he's walking out of the lobby, these paintings catch his eye, and these are framed paintings of plates that had been from a monograph on birds of paradise that Cooper had illustrated. And he stops and he says, "Who painted those and how can I meet him?" And they had to let him down gently and say, "Ooh, William Cooper's a really reclusive fellow. He doesn't really care for visitors. So I don't know, but it's David Attenborough." So he eventually, through his sources, tracked down Cooper's address, wrote to him. Cooper invited him to come visit. He lived in this beautiful home in the Australian rainforest, and they became really good friends. Attenborough commissioned Cooper to do some bird of paradise paintings, and this is worth mentioning beyond the obvious point that the apex of achievement for any bird artist is when Sir David Attenborough wants your work. But it began a very interesting conversation between them that I think has broader implications for bird art in general, and just kind of shows you the different nature of the traditions that work between that more traditional scientific illustration and other kinds of painting. So William Cooper's name and reputation as a bird artist was built on traditional scientific illustration. He's illustrated a number of important monographs in collaboration with the ornithologist William Forshaw, including my all-time favorite, Parrots of the World. But as we've discussed, there are obvious constraints that come along with working in that tradition. The biggest one being you can't paint shadows, but another one being the birds have to be positioned in a certain way. And this was of concern to Attenborough, who wanted paintings of birds of paradise. And you can't, you've got to show those guys in display. To show them in less dynamic poses, I mean, these are the birds who are notorious for their gregarious courtship dances. The protea will actually clear leaf litter from the forest floor to make himself room to dance. So when you're dealing with birds who have those kind of moves, having to paint them in constrained postures, upright, wings folded, it's not going to work. And so David Attenborough wanted them in their full glory, and I think we can agree that Cooper delivered. That Dancers in Red painting, look at the feathers on that tail, the softness, it's just absolutely exquisite. And the brown sicklebills on the right, one of William Cooper's favorite things to do in life was study dappled light. So that's light that's coming through the forest and making its way through the leaves, and it casts fascinating shadow patterns. And so he had to really get his fill of that when doing this style of painting, because he wouldn't have been able to do that when working on those scientific monographs. So he really is an artist that's kind of working in two different modes, or two different traditions. What's also really remarkable about Cooper's work is his skill as a botanical artist. So he's quite different from Audubon in that respect, because for Cooper, the plants mattered as much as the birds. He would never paint a bird sitting on a tree that it wouldn't naturally perch in, and he could tell you the fruiting cycle to boot, and identify the lichen. So here's an example of one of his botanical studies that he would do. And then you can see how it goes from botanical study and then makes its way into a bird painting. So studying Cooper's work forced me to confront two gaps in my own work. First, he made me realize that a key component of any curriculum for any bird artist should involve a botanical element, at least in my view. And so looking at Cooper's work in this aspect of it particularly inspired me to complete a certificate in botanical illustration from the Royal Botanical Gardens in Edinburgh. And so here's some of my homework assignments and my graduation piece of a cyclamen. Now, I realized that at the beginning of this talk, I mentioned I wanted to be an oil painter. So what the heck am I doing going and getting a credential in watercolor painting? Well, watercolor is it's a great drawing medium, if that makes sense. From the 19th century, they actually didn't call watercolor paintings paintings. They called them drawings, and they called the brushes pencils. And it's phenomenally useful as a medium when you're doing really precise drawing. And when you need to do anatomical studies, which you do, and when you're drawing feathers and they're in color, watercolor to the rescue. So I've always been so inspired by that element of Cooper's work as well. He does his homework. He does meticulous academic studies before he does those paintings. And he's doing those in watercolor, even if he ultimately ends up painting the bird in oil or acrylic. He had just pages and pages of these you can see they're annotated with his notes. And so gaining competency in watercolor was really important for me. And it's really looking at Cooper's work that galvanized me to do that. Because the better you know it, the better you can paint it, or so the theory goes. So I'm going to move now to a Canadian painter. This is J. Fenwick Lansdowne. He is Canada's bird painter. He, at age 19, had his first exhibition of watercolor paintings at the Royal Ontario Museum. So strong start at a young age. And he would go on to publish a series of very successful coffee table books, including Birds of the Northern Forest and Eastern Forest. He also made the paintings for a monograph of rare birds of China, and then the blockbuster, I'm kidding, but it really should be a bestseller, Rails of the World. So if you're ever going to actually see rails, this book's a good way to do so. He worked in watercolor and gouache, and in terms of how he worked, this photo of him demonstrates that he's studying a museum skin. So he's got that bird in front of him. But as I described when talking about the natural history artists, like that bird it's like this, and its eyes are sometimes stuffed with cotton. Kind of hard to breathe some life into that. And so this didn't work for Audubon, but it ended up working for Lansdowne and for lots of other artists, Cooper included, where he'll do these field sketches. And this is one area where bird artists are really strong, gesture drawing. You do not have a lot of time in the field before the bird moves. And so we have to get really good at drawing quickly and getting those angles and gestures down. And you get pages of these sketches, and they're not detailed, but the information they convey is really amazing. And it's quite useful to help animate. And so I wanted to include that picture of his sketches, so you got a sense of that as a working method. So these are two of the plates from Rails of the World, and I really think this demonstrates that facts become art through love description, because the accuracy here is apparent, but you can just feel that sort of skulky tension, the tension of the movement, frozen in place, but ready to bolt at any moment. But look at that extraordinary treatment of feathers. So I wanted to share these because I just think they're so extraordinary. But Lansdowne, in addition to this, also did watercolor paintings of birds out in their natural habitat that weren't for monographs. And as I was preparing, I got a bit of a kick out of this part of my talk, because I thought, well, I'm stunned into silence more or less when I see these paintings. And so I thought, well, maybe that's a definition for art, like a painting that's just so beautiful you find yourself at a loss for words. Maybe we can try that on. But I was also tempted to borrow from Keats. Truth is beauty and beauty is truth, and that's all you need to know. I'm paraphrasing the language a bit, and I realize he was talking about aggression or that's one interpretation, but I don't think it's all that far-fetched to apply that concept here. There's that beauty in the accuracy, in that truth. When I look at those crest feathers on the kingfisher, like he's just captured the spikiness of those barbs so exquisitely, and yet there's nothing clinical about it. This painting tells you lots of information about a bird, and yet you feel like you could also run your hand along that fence. So I don't know that I can say much more about these paintings other than revel in how lovely they are to behold. I'm rounding the bend into the last two artists I'm going to speak about in tonight's talk, and the first is a name I'm pretty sure you've heard before, Robert Bateman. Yes, I know that's not a bird. That's a cheetah. Um, but he's here tonight because I have a really clear memory of standing in my parents' living room when I was about 5 years old, staring in complete amazement at this Robert Bateman painting of a cheetah. And I stood there standing completely still for once. And my mom said to me, "Can you believe someone painted that?" And I actually didn't believe her. By this time, I was drawing a lot. Crayon was my primary medium, but it just didn't seem possible to me that the same force that resulted in this and my waxy squiggles could, happen. Like the one didn't seem like it could possibly lead to the other. And so I just decided that denial was the safest option for my developing artist ego and said, no, no, he didn't paint that. And my mom said, well, okay, technically you're right. This is called a print. It's a picture of his painting so that lots of people can have them in their houses. I think she still sensed I was skeptical. So she took me upstairs and she had all of Robert Bateman's coffee table books and had stood in line to get them autographed. And she showed me a picture of him painting at his easel. And she said, look, see, he does do these paintings. So she'd given me proof. I looked dejectedly at my box of crayons and tried to carry on. I realize Robert Bateman's a bit of a polarizing figure. Many in the art world sneer at him as a result of his commercial success or because they don't see wildlife art as a worthy genre or some combination of those two. I've included him in tonight's talk because his work is a vehicle for a very important discussion about the effect of modern art on representational painting of the 20th century. And when I say representational painting, I mean painting things that look like the things. Um, I don't have the space in this talk to unpack modernism, why it came about, and the ruptures that it brought with it. So I'll simply say this: when representational art, a tradition that had been around for half a millennia, is brought to its knees so quickly and so dramatically as we saw in the 20th century when abstract art and abstract expressionism arrived on the scene, it's not just about one thing. It's the result of many forces working at once. It could be the invention of photography, Darwin's theory of natural selection and what it meant for both science and religion, not one but two world wars in relatively quick succession. So there's lots going on. The art world's going to reflect that. And it's not my intention this evening to bash modern art, though technically I would be punching up. And whether I care for it or not aesthetically is irrelevant. My primary quibble with it is philosophical. It's that idea that instead of saying, here's another way of looking at things, it's saying, here's the only way of looking at things. And any other style of painting is passe and invalid. And that attitude of only abstract art is real art was really prevalent in Robert Bateman's formative years. He grew up, like many of the artists I've spoken of this evening, fascinated by nature. In his youth, he was a member of the Young Naturalist Club at the Royal Ontario Museum. He's actually quite adept at making museum specimens. And in his early 20s, he traveled the world with his best friend in a Land Rover and made sketches of everything he saw. And I have a quote from here up on the slide saying, drawing is a way of painting attention or of paying attention. And one of his drawings is here as well. And you can see too, and I wanted to include some of the field sketches from the different artists so you can see that they've all got a different hand. You can see that their styles are slightly different. And so this is one from Bateman's, but he thought at that time that if he was going to be an artist, he was going to paint abstractly. And so that's what he did for a time. And then fortunately, Andrew Wyeth changed his mind. Now, Andrew Wyeth is an American painter. He was one of the few who managed actually to do quite well making representational art in the 20th century. If you're not familiar with his work, I've included his Christina's World, probably his most famous painting is in the upper right. And then these other two paintings were made around the early 1960s. And Bateman went to a show of Andrew Wyeth's in Buffalo, New York around that time. And he calls this his road to Damascus moment. He went to that show and he looked at these paintings and he saw, they're painted representationally, realistically. If he can do it, I can do it. And from then on, it changed the direction of his work. And you can really see Wyeth's influence in Bateman's paintings. You can see that I call it this lovely lugubriousness. Like there's this moodiness of tone and muted color, and it really shows through in Bateman's work. And it's interesting, Bateman's known as a wildlife artist, but he actually thinks of himself as a landscape artist primarily. Like, he's so interested in the scenery. And of course, he's, featuring wildlife within it quite prominently. But a lot of his paintings, the scenery is as prominent as well. And I think the paintings I've selected this evening really show that. Um, this is my favorite Robert Bateman painting. But again, like, you can see Wyeth's influence on that. So that can just go to show you that sometimes something you see as an artist can completely change the road you're on. One of my favorite things that I heard Robert Bateman say, and I was very lucky, I got to take a 3-day workshop with him in 2016. So I got to hear him express these views in person, well over 3 days, watching him take a painting from conception to signature. It was extraordinary. But he said something that really stuck with me, where he said, "We are painting in the Delta as artists right now." Where all the rivers meet before joining the ocean, all the artistic movements throughout history, we don't have to be in competition with another or displace one another. Artists can draw from one or more as they see fit. And I admit that's an aspirational mindset for me. I'm still working through a lot of hard feelings about modern art, but I thought that was a wonderful way of approaching it as well. And he demonstrated how he lived by what he said. And so I've put up here a slide on the left of his beautiful red-winged blackbird and rail fence painting. And then this is an artist, Franz Klein, who's painting in the 1950s and painting abstractly. And you really can see the strength of design. And that's one of the things that Bateman really thinks abstract art has to offer all painters, is that really strong sense of compositional design and using line to give that structure. And so he talks about how he uses that as sort of compositional scaffolding for his paintings. And when you put them side by side, you really can see that those influences are working together. Now, lots of people have criticized Robert Bateman for his commercial success, which came in the form of record-setting print sales in the 80s and 90s. I think one way to look at that is to ask maybe what it says largely about what's going on. Is it possible that when a response to an artist's work is that intense, maybe it's not just the Cardinals? Maybe part of me wonders if it wasn't the result of a public starved of beauty for so many decades, finally getting a glimpse of it again. And this is the part where I'm going to reiterate the reminder that I'm new to art history. These are my personal opinions, and remember, I'm the girl who goes birding in the Rijksmuseum, so take it with a grain of salt. Speaking of museums, though, Robert Bateman's work isn't in many art museums. Wildlife art museums, sure. His biggest museum show was in 1987 at the Smithsonian, at a natural history museum. It was a huge success, but he often points out how artists who paint wildlife are hyphenated artists, like wildlife artists. And so that distinction, it irks him. So now that I've shared that, gotten that off my chest a bit, we're going to talk about the final artist of this evening. And as I've said, he's my favorite artist of all time, Ray Harris Ching. I don't throw the G word around very often, genius, but I think when it comes to drawing, I think Ray Harris Ching really is. His fascination with birds began at a young age on a school trip to a museum when he stole hummingbird specimens. Stealing is bad, but he says, like, it was a compulsion. He said he had to have them, and then he feels horribly guilty about this. The quote that I have for him says, "By morning, my 10-year-old brain was unable to bear either the pressure or the guilt or the burden of having such beauty at my command." And so I wanted to share that story because you're going to see, as a thread that weaves throughout Ray Harris Ching's life, this need to be surrounded by beautiful objects from nature. School was not his thing. At age 15, he got a job at a newspaper and then worked his way up in an ad agency. And by age 18, he was the art director and one of the highest paid commercial artists in New Zealand. His drawing abilities are extraordinary. And at night, he'd work on his own paintings. And like Bateman, he thought, okay, that means I've got to paint abstract. And this changed when an Australian artist by the name of Sir William Dargie, who is an established portrait artist, he painted Queen Elizabeth II's portrait, stopped by Ray's studio. He was there because when you have drawing skills as legendary as Ray Harris Ching, word gets out, and so other artists want to see what the buzz is about. And amidst the clutter of Ray's studio was a bird's nest with eggs in it. And he was still into birds, still collecting natural history objects, but hadn't found an art outlet for it yet. And so Sir Dargy noticed the nest and said, "Ooh, I'd like to paint those eggs." And Ching responded, "Well, where's the social relevance in that?" And Sir Dargy said, "Well, I just like the look of it. That's all." That was a paradigm shift for him because, as someone who had come to believe that in a world where modernism dominated, that painting something just because it was beautiful was deeply frowned on, to suddenly say, you know what, maybe that's good enough for me. And so it began. His first exhibition at age 26 was called 30 Birds in New Zealand. It was an instant success. It attracted the attention of Sir William Collins of Collins Natural History publications, as well as Sir Peter Scott, an eminent ornithologist and bird painter, and founder of the Wildlife Fowl Trust at Slimbridge Estate. And so when Sir Scott got wind of these paintings and saw one of them, he sent Ray Harris Ching a telegram, and it said, "Have seen your watercolor of an owl. Aerodynamically preposterous, but painting of feathers among the very best ever seen. Suggest you call it Slimbridge if ever in England." And so that was all Ray Harris Ching needed to hear. In 1966, on Christmas Day, he left for the UK. And while there, he met with Collins Publishing. They had been searching for an illustrator for the Reader's Digest book of British birds. Every bird artist in the British Isles had been assessed and found wanting. They were on the brink of abandoning the project when they encountered Ching, and he somewhat rashly agreed to do 230 full color plates and said he could do it in under a year. It almost broke him. He was ill, exhausted, and penniless by the time it was over. Now, the penniless part was somewhat of his own doing. So remember the hummingbirds. Signing on to this project gave him a great excuse to buy an entire collection of bird skins and mounts of British birds that had come up for auction at Sotheby's. Now, in Victorian England, bird taxidermy was huge, but then it crashed hard in the mid 20th century, and this would have been early 60s. The market had gone completely dormant, and so Ching shows up with his advance for the book project, burning a hole in his pocket, and starts bidding on the whole lot. And as that quote says, he had no intention of stopping, even though he ran out of money at the end of day one. And so he calls his publisher, gets the rest of it, his advance, and blows the whole wad on bird skins. He has not painted yet. Or maybe he's started, but not really. So we're talking about thousands of birds. And so in addition to the financial strain, this creates the very immediate and pressing logistical problem. How is he getting these back to his studio? So he goes outside and hails 20 London cabs, straps the golden eagle mount to the roof of one of them, and makes his way back to his studio and has a very busy year. The book sold millions of copies. He'd got a bit of a raw deal on the contract in terms of royalties, but it opened up so many doors for him, including a long-standing relationship with a very prestigious gallery in London that has served him quite well. So I've included these two plates because this is not your standard field guide art. And I am not saying that pejoratively. I love David Allen Sibley and Roger Tory Peterson. But look at these birds. Like look at those poses. I mean, if you want a lively illustration of a bird, you go for the guy that does the aerodynamically preposterous owls. And that's what they were trying to do with this book, was shake things up a bit. Now, I'm a little skeptical about calling it a field guide because it is large. I don't like it doesn't comfortably fit in a backpack, but it's sort of a hybrid of field guide and coffee table book, but the paintings in it are extraordinary. And so this obviously puts Ray Harris Ching's name on the map. And so after this, he works in watercolors for the next 10 or 15 years, doing incredibly tight, very, very precise drawings. And again, I have no proof of this. I have at best a theory, but this on the left, I have, remember the first artist we looked at tonight, Albrecht Dürer, with the wing of the blue roller. So he's also done some beautiful botanical pieces, and this is called The Great Piece of Turf. It's one of his well-known watercolor paintings for this time. There is a part of me that deeply wonders if the alternate name for Ray Harris Ching's painting here couldn't be called Take That, Dürer, because like you sort of see the connection and the similarity between the two of them. Again, I am surmising there, but it captured my attention, and I wanted to share it. Like, look at the foliage and how that's painted. And he did this from life. Like, he would chop up bits of hedges and haul them into his studio, and sometimes that got a little dicey. So when he was painting this painting of a kestrel on that burlap sack full of hay, I mean, this is not a painting you're knocking out in an hour or two. So several days or possibly longer into it, he notices the lines on the weave are no longer matching up, and realizes, oh dear, I might have a problem. Um, and so after he works in watercolor until probably the late 70s, and then around then, early 80s, he shifts to oil paint. And I want to talk about that shift a little bit and its significance. And again, I am somewhat surmising here, but go with me. Um, there's a concept that it emerged around the time of the Renaissance and really solidified around the 1600s, but it's called the academic hierarchy. And what it is it's a ranking of genres or styles of painting. And right at the top, number one, in the number one spot, is what's called history painting. So those are those large scale oil paintings of biblical works or mythical scenes or battle scenes. And that's what really, if you wanted to be like a big deal oil painter, that's the kind of work you were going to aim for, is those big history paintings, wall size paintings. And then beneath that, in the two spot, is portraits. Now, for most of art history, portraits were done of royalty and the upper classes and the upper crust. It was not your average folk that were getting their portraits painted. That started to change, but it was a long time coming. And in 19th century France, when people started to paint peasants, it caused a bit of a stir. Where do birds fit on the academic hierarchy? That's what I wanted to know. And depending on which source you consult, some have a hierarchy that has a separate category for animals. Some don't mention them at all. Either way, they're at the bottom. Like, they are near the bottom, at or near. And so there is a part of me that wonders if Ray Harris Ching, in doing some of these oil painting portraits, isn't trying to paint his way into the hierarchy with birds. And so I've included that picture there just to get a sense of his painting process, because when you're studying an artist's work, paintings like, or images like this are actually as valuable, if not more, than the finished painting, because you want to know how they did the work. You want to be able to sleuth out their process. And so I've spent a lot of time studying these. The Common Bronze Wings is one of Ray Harris Ching's earlier oil paintings. This caused a huge stir when it was on display at the gallery. This was like quite a stampede to behold this beautiful piece. Just look at the shine, the way the light is catching those wing feathers and the iridescence. Like, it's just extraordinary. But you can also tell, if you compare this to his watercolor paintings, he's loosened up quite a bit. Like, he's gone from that extreme realism to it's still very realistic, but it is looser. So these are the bird portraiture. This is a sampling of some bird portraits he did, and there's a couple of points I'd like to make with these, other than just, you know, how gorgeous they are. But he is using a lot of the conventions of traditional oil painting, and he's putting birds as the subject. And when we think back to the 19th century paintings of the scientific illustrations or the scientific paintings, those were birds at the level of species. This is the individual bird. And so instead of painting a bird that's going to stand in and be the representative, like, these birds are on their own. Like, when you look at the amount of emotion in the face and the way that the silhouette is highlighted, all the conventions that portrait painters use are being used to convey birds here. And I really do think that's a departure and an act of some significance. So it's not just, I'm painting an egret, I'm painting this egret. And so these are just such extraordinarily beautiful paintings on their own. But I do think there's a bigger piece going on here. And so, I mean, Robert Bateman was and remains very vocal about the marginalization of wildlife artists. And I'm curious, I wonder if what Ray Harris Ching is doing with his work is just, you know, quietly saying, I'm going to paint birds into the hierarchy. Ray Harris Ching is notoriously reclusive. There's not a television interview he hasn't turned down. You can't reach him. And so he's not going to be someone who goes out there on his soapbox and shares his views. And I don't say that in any way to disparage Robert Bateman, but he's just kind of quietly going on a mission here. And so you'll recall what I said about paintings at the top of the hierarchy. The big large scale paintings of myth and biblical scenes and scenes from history. So this is shaped like an altarpiece, and that's one of the most traditional earlier forms of Western art, would be these large scale paintings for churches. And so he is using some of those conventions and painting birds into that. And so this is 60 species of bird. This painting took him 10 months to do. It's called the Gilded Triptych. And in one of the essays I read, like, he actually says, yeah, the inspiration for this piece was the Ghent altarpiece. And so if any of you have seen The Monuments Men, it's the movie with George Clooney and Matt Damon when they try to protect art from the Nazis in World War II. The Ghent altarpiece is one of the pieces that they're really after in that movie. And so this is a bold move. And again, like, maybe it's what's going on, perhaps not, but either way, it's nothing short of a masterpiece and an extraordinary move forward, I think, for bird art. And so that brings me to the conclusion for tonight. And I wanted to conclude with a quote, not about art. This is actually from a book that Henry Benson wrote. He's a naturalist. He wrote in 1928. And this is a quote that came from part of his book, where I believe he's looking at seabirds. He spent a year, it's kind of a Walden Pond-esque type book, and he spent a year on Cape Cod, just living out in nature. And this is what he says about birds, and it's just moved me so much, because I think it's really echoing some of what some of the artists are doing in the paintings we discussed tonight, where birds are their own subject. They are not brethren. They are not underlings. They are other nations, caught with ourselves in the net of life and time, fellow prisoners of the splendor and travail of the earth. And so, as we've seen the trajectory of art move along, we've started to realize that birds are a worthy subject all on their own. And we know now, thanks to scientific research advancements, more about birds than we ever have. They use tools, they build homes, they have languages, they woo lovers, they choose mates, they raise children, they grieve, they dance. Those aren't sentimental notions, those are ornithological research findings. And I believe that the same information that's presented in that research can also be inspiration for great paintings. Birds are so much more than ornament. And though that's what they have been through large parts of history. But facts become art through love. And studying the works of these artists has been such a key component in my ongoing training as an artist. And it's been an absolute pleasure to share my thoughts with you tonight. So thank you so much for joining me. I would be more than happy to answer any questions if anyone's got any. Thank you again.
That was awesome, Terri Susan. And somebody made in their comment in the chat box, phenomenal presentation.
Oh,
Your
thank you.
research and your passion for this topic is very, very evident